Welcome to the Layer by Layer Poetic Features video for Psalm 29. Our goal is to reveal the distinctive beauty and power of the original text of Psalm 29 as the next best thing to knowing Hebrew yourself. The three poetic features are called Thunder, Glory and Strength, and More and More. The word for thunder in Hebrew is also the word for voice or sound. In ancient Near Eastern background, there's a story of Baal, a Canaanite god, thundering 7 times after victory. In this psalm, God thunders explicitly in verse 3, and poetically 7 more times with the sound of the Lord, or the voice of the Lord, a Hebrew phrase that sounds like peals of thunder booming. With these 7 poetic peals of thunder, the Lord is showing that He is victor, not the false god Baal. As the overview video describes, in Canaanite mythology, Baal was the storm god who brought rain for their crops. In one prominent epic, he thunders 7 times as part of his victory cry. Psalm 29 repudiates any idea of Baal being in charge of storms, rain, or thunder. 7 times the Hebrew reads Kol Adonai, which could be the sound of the Lord, the voice of the Lord, or the thunder of the Lord. Verse 3 makes it clear that this is thunder, the sound of the Lord against the water. The glorious God has thundered. The first 3 rolls of thunder evoke a mighty storm full of power and majesty. Next, the thunder is portrayed as breaking cedars, breaking the very trees used to make Asherah poles, the symbol for Baal's consort in Canaanite religion. The thunder is so powerful that it makes Lebanon and Sirion, mountains north of Israel, to skip like a calf and like a wild ox. Baal's symbol was of a bull calf, and he was himself often depicted with bull horns on his head. Think of the golden calves made in the kingdom of Israel to worship the God of the land. The golden calf Aaron made in the wilderness was in anticipation of the God of Canaan, the land the people were going to. The expectation was that Baal was God of Canaan. But here God mocks Baal as a startled calf, the very picture of trembling and fear. Baal has no power compared to the Lord's. The 5th roll of thunder is the most cryptic. The sound or thunder of the Lord, hewing with lightning bolts. The lightning works well with the thunder, as storm imagery, but the hewing is not so obvious. Refer to our exegetical issues video to understand how hewing stone in the mountains, along with cedars of Lebanon, evokes a royal building project. Building a temple, after a great victory, was the expectation in the ancient world for people involved in the victory to worship the God who granted it to them. Since the Lord is the victorious one, He wants the worship owed to Him. The thunder in verse 8 causes the wilderness to tremble. Whereas the mountains were understood to be the home of foreign gods, the wilderness was often understood as the home of demons, often called by names such as jackals and hyenas and owls in the prophets. The Lord is more powerful than both, shown physically by His shaking them so that they tremble. Solidity was a very common metaphor for security, such that the one who could not be shaken was one who had no fears but was secure against threats. The one who is shaken or trembling, on the other hand, was the one vulnerable to being overpowered by enemies. The wilderness is unable to withstand God's thunder and is at His mercy. Perhaps the epitome of trembling is that of a mother in childbirth. A fallow deer represents all of living creation here, trembling helplessly at the thunder. Unlike the cedars, however, the deer is not harmed, but rather gives birth. The imagery is of God's unstoppable might, but it is not one of wild violence. The power is clearly directed to the humbling of the mountains and the wilderness, where foreign gods and enemies reside, but to the bringing forth of new life among creation. The stripped forests may again hint at mocking the Asherah poles denuded of their finery. The purpose of all the thunder is the same as the psalm's opening, to call all to come worship God in his temple. Both the psalm and the thunder are successful. Now we'll move to glory and strength. In the first verse, glory and strength belong to the Lord alone, and divine beings are called on to acknowledge and express that. By the end of the psalm, all in the Lord's temple are properly calling out glory, but they are not calling out strength. Instead, the Lord is giving out strength to his people. This casts the entire psalm as about strength. Strength that belongs to the Lord, but that is demonstrated and given out to his people. The storm thus becomes on behalf of his people. Psalm 29 opens with a command to divine beings to ascribe or attribute all glory and strength to the Lord alone. The Baal epic, which reveals so much Canaanite mythological background that helps make sense of this psalm, is the battle between Baal and the sea god, for who will be truly king and receive worship. Psalm 29 answers, neither. All glory and honor of kingship belong to the Lord alone. The audience for this command is divine beings, the divine council that would assemble around the Lord and over which he was king. We read of the divine council explicitly in Job 1 and 1 Kings 22, and find allusions elsewhere, as in Psalm 148. All the hosts of heaven are enjoined to worship God as well, and not to worship anyone else. These hosts of heaven were understood as the rulers of the nations, which meant the nations would worship whomever their ruler worshipped. These are the expectations set up in verses 1 and 2 and 10 and 11, the exhortation for divine beings, rulers of nations, to worship the Lord, specifically to ascribe to him glory and strength. This means to acknowledge all glory and strength as having their source in the Lord, so no one else can boast, and that he alone deserves praise for them. This would be humiliating for any rivals, who are thus implicitly denied any glory and strength of their own. Glory appears verbally at both the beginning and end of the storm. First, the glorious God thunders in verse 3, and at the end of all in the temple cry out, glory. In verse 9, God is recognized as being the source of glory in his power and majesty, and as the only legitimate recipient of glory, as the only one to be worshipped and acclaimed as glorious. The word for strength does not appear again until the final verse, in which the Lord gives strength to his people. Strength becomes a frame for the entire poem. But there is a reversal. Instead of being the sole recipient of strength, as he was with glory, he becomes the distributor of strength to his people. This may turn expectations on their head. God was not seeking worship purely for his own sake. He was seeking right worship in the context of relational obligations, meaning that a people in right relationship with their God and King will worship him rightly. But the king equally has obligations toward his people, and one such obligation is to provide strength to protect and sustain his people. What was already seen with the thunder, wreaking devastation against God's enemies, but bringing forth new life among the animals, is mirrored here. The storm was a picture of God's strength, wreaking devastation on his enemies, but the role of that strength is to be given to his people to protect and sustain them. The mighty storm should be terrifying to God's enemies. It is a reminder of God's power and strength, which are at the service of his people. our final feature is more and more. Another prominent feature of Psalm 29 is the distinctive pattern called staircase parallelism, in which one line will have a series of elements, for example, A, B, C, and the next line will omit the first element but add another, as in B, C, D, and then perhaps again C, D, E. The effect is increased anticipation in the listener, as the listener knows some of what to expect, but cannot anticipate the final element. When the element comes, there is a strong sense of closure. This strong sense of closure mirrors the message of strength discussed above. We also find this pattern in the Song of Deborah in Judges 5, and in the Song of the Sea in Exodus 15. It's also known from Ugaritic epics, indicating it was a generally known poetic device. This pattern may be associated with the genre of victory song, giving Psalm 29 a triumphant feel. Verse 1 is very repetitive. Ascribe to the Lord, divine beings. Ascribe glory and strength to the Lord. The first line calls on the divine beings to ascribe something to the Lord, but it doesn't specify what. The second line reveals what they're supposed to ascribe: glory and strength. From the first, there is an expectation that something is going to be ascribed, but the hearer has to wait to find out what it is. This focuses attention on just what it is, which reveals how the psalm highlights from the very beginning the glory and strength we just discussed. The pattern continues in verse 2 with an elaboration on what kind of glory is to be ascribed: the glory his name deserves. Of all the kinds of glory possible, the glory appropriate to God's name is what is called for here. In verse 3, the sound or thunder of the Lord is over the waters, against the water. Whereas the water of rivers was a lifeline, the water of the seas represented chaos, the threat to order and prosperity. For the Lord to thunder over or against the waters, he's proclaiming his victory over threats. In the third line, this is intensified to be over many waters or much water. God is not just victorious over some threats, but over many great threats. Ultimately, the phrase much water points to the greatest water of all, the flood, which will be introduced in verse 10. In verse 5, the sound or thunder of the Lord is breaking cedars. In the next line, it is specifically the cedars of Lebanon. Cedars were known for their loftiness and beauty, and the cedars of Lebanon were the most renowned of all. It's as if the Lord is known to have mastery over the mighty, indeed, even over the mightiest of the mighty. Again, there is an intensification of the claim that the Lord has mastery. In verse 8, the sound or thunder of the Lord is announced a third time, this time making the wilderness tremble. In the second line, it's the wilderness of Kadesh that is trembling. Kadesh is the name of at least two geographical locations, one north of Israel, past the mountains of Lebanon and Sirion, and another in the Sinai Peninsula. The name may have been chosen as much for its sound as for its location, however, as dressed in holy attire in verse 2 sounds very similar to the wilderness of Kadesh in Hebrew, the Hadrat Kodesh and Midbar Kadesh. The hint is that the holy attire called for by the divine beings is the very trembling of the wilderness. In verse 10, it is now the Lord who has been enthroned over the flood, and in the second line, he sits enthroned as king forever. At first, it may have seemed that the flood was the key point, elevating the Lord from master over a storm to master over the greatest storm of all, the flood itself. He surpasses Baal as much as the flood surpasses every other storm. But the stair-stepping points in a slightly different direction, that not only is the Lord powerful, but he is king forever. This shifts the entire poem from the Lord as master over storms to the Lord as king who demonstrates his power in the storm. This prepares for the final verse, in which this king grants strength to his people and blesses them with peace. The overall effect of the poetic feature is to move the poem confidently on, with explicit space for developing the line of thought. Sometimes this is filling in gaps, as in verse 1, sometimes intensifying, as in verses 3 and 5, and sometimes making connections, as in verse 8, and sometimes reorienting the flow of thought, as in verse 10. Each move is cohesive and thoroughly woven into the very fabric of the psalm, leaving no doubt about how the poet wanted to guide his audience. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength, for the Lord gives strength to his people. This has been the Poetic Features video for Psalm 29, in which we explore the natively Hebrew poetic nature of the psalm. Our overview video provides a coherent interpretation of the psalm, and our exegetical issues video discusses other scholarly views. All these videos are offered free of charge thanks to the generosity of our donors. Please visit us at cdbr.org to learn more. Thank you.